Hello, everyone. Welcome to another 2023 SpringDocs screening. My name is Armando Zamudio, and I am the Public Programs and Events Coordinator here at IDA. For our blind and low vision attendees, I'm going to identify myself. I am a light-skinned Mexican-American with messy hair, wearing a black shirt, a black jacket, and sitting in an office space. Thank you to our media partners, Variety and KCRW, for sponsoring our 2023 SpringDocs. This evening, we'll have a conversation between director Darren Foster, producer Diane Becker, film subject Kurt MacKenzie, and moderated by Josh Campbell, whose film American Pain premiered at Tribeca 2022 and streaming everywhere on Max. To help us grow by donating and interested in joining IDA's global network of documentary professionals, please visit documentary.org/membership. To see more amazing films like this, please visit www.documentary.org/SpringDocs. Before we get started, I'd like to give a brief land acknowledgement. We recognize the Gabrielino, Tongva, and Chumash people as the past, present, and future caretakers of the land, water, and cultural resources in the unceded territory of Los Angeles. Thank you so much to Andrea Lust for interpreting this discussion. And with that, I'll pass it on to Josh. Thank you.
I guess, Darren, just to start, anytime you see an incredible film like American Pain, I think one question that we all have is, how did this come about? And so can you just walk us through the origin? And I understand it includes you being chased by the George brothers down Interstate 95.
That is correct. Is it on? Whoop. I think, Kurt and I were probably crossing paths around the same time. I didn't know at the time, but in 2009, I was doing a story about these pain clinics, and obviously American Pain came on my radar because it was on everybody's radar who was using drugs or who was selling drugs at the time. And I went to go film the clinic. I pulled up in front. I was working with my wife at the time. She's still my wife, but we were working together then. And I took one shot of the pain clinic, and next thing I know, we were surrounded by Derek Nolan, Chris George, and a couple other big guys, and they chased us down I-95. And chase went on for a long time. We eventually ran out of gas, pulled over to the side of the road. They pulled up behind us. The cops came, broke us up. I took down the license plate, traced it, and that's the first time I heard of Chris and Jeff George.
And then what went into you deciding I have to turn this into a film?
At the time, I thought we kind of were on the tail end of this opioid crisis. Florida started cracking down. Kurt and his team went into action. The George brothers were arrested, put in jail. Little did I know, I think anybody really knew, that heroin was on the horizon, and then fentanyl. And as I was looking back, I realized this story was sort of the beginning of it all. It was really what sort of paved the way for what we're experiencing today. So.
No, most definitely. And Diane, to you, in your role as producer, can you just talk about this experience and what is it that made you know that this was a story that had to be told?
I mean, Darren and I have been friends for a long time. Our kids are the same age. So we basically were talking about this when they were in preschool, and now they're 13. So I just want to say this is how long this project has sort of been, brewing.
Really fun at a cocktail party.
Yeah, exactly. So. And, I just remember Darren telling me about the story, and I was like, this is insane. This is incredible. This is unbelievable. And everybody needs to know this story. It's just, documentary films are at their best when they have characters, and everybody in this film is a character of some kind, and the story is, obviously important and urgent. And so it was just what can I do? I want to help. You know what I mean?
No, most definitely. And Kurt, to you, I want to ask you about, as the investigator here that was working on this, one thing that was striking, in addition to just the sheer hubris, right, and the greed of this operation, is, as you listen to some of the language, it's reminiscent of the mob. Like you, I was an FBI agent before I went into journalism, and I was looking through that investigative lens, and I just kept thinking, this is a new version of the mafia, is it not?
So just to clarify, Jen and I were actually assigned to an organized crime task force. In South Florida, organized crime representatives are mostly from Eastern Europe, Russian mafia, unlike New York, where it's traditional Italian-American groups. And we treated this organization like an organized crime group. If you notice very closely at the end, it was a RICO prosecution, which was typically reserved for John Gotti and New York mobsters. We treated them exactly like New York mobsters because that's what they were. They're an organized crime group. They just happen to be all friends and family. So,
Darren, I want to ask you. I want to start at the end and ask you about the ending and film mechanics. And I think everyone in this room is interested in this process. How not only a film is made, but how you decide to end it. And one thing that was really interesting, I was watching this. Obviously, there was that very emotional moment from John, who was the computer guy, the informant, and he talks about his own son, dying from an overdose. And there's that quote where he says, "We've got to end these people. We've got to put them out of business." And I'm watching that through a TV lens, thinking if I was doing a TV news report on this, that would be my ending. It's resolute. There's a touch of hope. But you didn't do that. You go on to then we see Chris. He's getting out of prison. He's not only saying that, look, this isn't my fault. It's the victims. The victims are the reason why this happened. I didn't do anything wrong. And then we hear them basically plotting what's coming next, which is kind of infuriating. But it was incredible filmmaking. And why did you decide to end it that way?
I mean, I think the reason why we decided to end it that way is because it's the truth. Unfortunately, this story doesn't have a happy ending. There's not a pretty little bow on the end of it. Things are worse now than ever. This past year, another record, 110,000 people overdosed. And so I think, unfortunately, there's not a hopeful ending as it stands right now. And so that's the short answer, I guess. It's, we could have ended on Frisky, but I wanted to sort of, Chris to have the last word, because it also, on some level, echoes what the pharmaceutical companies say as well. Richard Sackler famously says, "We got to blame the addicts. That's how we get out of this." And so, to me, those echoes are really powerful. Maybe I'm too close to the opioid crisis, but I thought from Chris, it sounds remorseless. But from, I guess Purdue Pharma, it sounds like rational. So I just wanted to sort of put that out there to, make some sort of point, I guess.
No, extremely well done. And Kurt, I want to ask you, continuing with Chris, we hear from him, and there's this term in law enforcement called rationalization, right? Where, we hear Chris saying, look, I didn't do anything wrong. It's their fault. I just sold we sold it. We didn't write the prescription. All the things that he's trying to do to rationalize it. Take us into the mind of a criminal. Like, what is going through their mind as they're trying to justify this to themselves?
So let me be very clear and draw a sharp line of demarcation here. There are criminals, and then there are psychopaths who are also criminals. Most criminals are opportunists. Chris George is an opportunist, but he made it very clear, and you could see and hear the words coming out of his mouth. He is also very clearly a psychopath, a malignant narcissist, if you will. So he's a little bit different than your average quote-unquote criminal. And his brother exhibits very similar personality traits as well.
And Diane, to you, obviously you have the criminal network, but at the heart of this story is also, the tens of thousands of victims. And, there's that one moment, it was actually Kurt who was describing, and this was, I'm sure many of you had the same reaction, where, you're showing the files, and then Kurt talks about the random sampling of the number of people that have died, right? Possibly up to 3,000 people died from this operation. Can you talk to us about why it was so important to focus on those who have been impacted in this film?
I mean, I think that's the heart of why we tell these kind of stories, right? Is the impact they have, and being able to and put ourselves in these shoes, and I feel like most of us probably know somebody to some degree who's died of an opioid epidemic, or just an OD, and it, it's like these are the kind of stories that really try to sort of change the way we deal with things and really try to bring these sort of issues to light. And I think, that was one of the things that drew me in so much to want to be part of this project and sort of help Darren tell this story, was that, we can't make change if we can't show the real impact that, and the real tragedy and trauma that these people go through. And I think keeping it focused on the victims and the families is, really important.
And Darren, to you, I mean, on that same note, there was a quote from, one of the women in the film at the end where she says, quote, "Everyone got addicted. People lost their homes. They sold their kids food stamps. Some resorted to shoplifting. Some resorted to prostitution just to get those pills." What was it like going through this process? I mean, this is heavy stuff. How are you personally handling this as you're also trying to tell the story?
Yeah, I mean, the folks from Kentucky, I think, are an important part of the story because on many levels they're victims, even while they were sort of perpetrating, the street level aspect of this. But if you drive through, and Kurt's been in these areas as well, whole portions of this country have just been devastated by this epidemic. And I think, we see it a bit here in Los Angeles and in New York, but if you go through some corners of this country, it's devastating what's happened. And for, a good many years, these pills were the economy of some of these towns in Appalachia and other corners of America. Like, there were no other jobs. The only job that you could really do to make any money was buy pills and resell them. And then, the temptation's there. So people get addicted, and then they got to, sell pills to feed their habit. And it's just a vicious cycle.
And then just finally on that note, I mean, Diane, all of your films have been about impact, right? I mean, I urge you all to look at the catalog of films. I mean, it's about impact, and it's about awareness. What are the key things that you want people to take away as they watch this film?
That this is still an epidemic, right? That this is still happening, that there are still people out there either dealing drugs illegally or, and it's also the pharmaceutical companies that are still, frankly guilty. I mean, that was all the beauty in the bloodshed, right? Like, that's the other side of the coin is Nan Goldin and her fight against the Sacklers. And this story is like a perfect complement to that, right? Because we're telling the story, more on the street and more about the victims and the families. And then the people, like the ground zero of kind of where it all began, right? Like, you're sort of, it seems unbelievable until you watch the film and you're like, oh my God, like how did this happen? And it happened very simply. Like, it's like kind of these like crazy loopholes, right? And it's like, we're not paying attention. We're all distracted by our lives. And, part of the power of documentary is bringing these things to people so that they can see them and then kind of go, okay, what do I need to do in my own personal life and or in my community to either help or, just bear witness to where we're at, and how can we do better?
No, very well said. And you mentioned big pharma, the pharmaceutical companies. I'm curious, Kurt, from your viewpoint, do you think we'll see the pharmaceutical companies actually facing some kind of serious criminal liability for not only this opioid crisis that we described, but also with fentanyl, which we'll talk about in a second? Do you think that the buck will ever stop with them?
I hope so. So let me make something very clear. One of the things that we realized towards the end of this investigation, this is 5 years worth of work for me anyway, by the way, over 5 years worth of work. The answer to this crisis is not law enforcement. It is policy. It is legislation. That is the only way to fix this. Mental health treatment, addiction treatment, call it what you like. Law enforcement is not the answer. But what we did do was shine a light on this issue. And if you've ever been in a house full of vermin, roaches, you turn the lights on, what do the roaches do? They scatter, right? So we turned the lights on, and this case got so much publicity, not just from the folks to my left and right, but we were covered by multiple news outlets, magazines all over the country. And this is actually what spurred the change in legislation in Florida, is embarrassing those in power into doing the right thing. So I think eventually the chain reaction effect, hopefully through policy, through legislation, will get to the pharmaceutical companies and the people primarily responsible for this.
And Kurt, one more for you. Darren mentioned, this isn't a film with a happy ending. Obviously, we know that so many people were impacted. One thing that we heard you say yourself in the film is that, committing fraud is just a matter of understanding the system and taking advantage of vulnerabilities to commit a crime. Sounds pretty simple. To you, as a former FBI agent, are there still vulnerabilities in the system that you are concerned about that could lead to a repeat of this?
100%. But the difference between now and years ago when we were doing this is partially thanks to this film, but also to other media coverage, is that now everybody knows, right? Everybody has seen and heard the weaknesses and the shortcomings of our system, of policy, and of legislation. So after this, it's in the hands of the people who are responsible for those issues to make the changes.
And just one more staying with Kurt, because I don't know, do y'all remember the DEA guy, this consultant who kept showing up in the film? What was with this guy, Kurt? I mean, you have a retired law enforcement officer who, presumably as a DEA agent, he helped dismantle these organizations. Was he naive? Is he complicit?
He was greedy, just like the George brothers were, right? So he made excuses, and he got himself to do unholy things for money. So that is unforgivable as far as I'm concerned as a law enforcement officer. But all law enforcement are not created equal. He is the bottom of the barrel. And if he's listening or hearing this, too bad.
And Darren, I mentioned fentanyl, right? Which that's the crisis that we're currently in. I mean, talk about the commonalities that you see, and I know you've looked into this as well. I mean, what are the storytelling opportunities there? Do you think that can help create impact? Because in the news we tell these stories all the time, but the attention span is so. It's so brief. People are, they watch it. It's in one ear, it's and out the other. Unless you know someone who's been impacted, you may not feel it the same. But talk about just the power that this kind of film can have in that space.
Yeah, I mean, just to piggyback a little bit on what Kurt was saying, I think one of the reasons why this was able to happen at the scale that it did, and then for the amount of years that it went on, was the fact that everybody had a little bit of plausible deniability. The doctors had an MRI that they could point to and be like, hey, this guy was, he told me he was hurt. The patients had a prescription from the doctor that says, I'm not a drug addict. I have a prescription from a doctor. And then, all up and down the line, the George brothers never thought they were going to get in trouble. They thought if anybody was going to get in trouble, it was going to be the doctors, because they're the ones that went to medical school and were the experts on all this. And so I think as long as people can sort of point a finger and sort of have some, piece of paper to say, I'm not responsible, and maybe we have to look ourselves in the mirror and ask ourselves what we would do in situations like this. But money is the most powerful drug of them all. And so I think, that's fundamentally, I think, what we have to do with fentanyl too. It's just like, where's the money? Follow the money.
Yeah. One thing that strikes me, Diane, is as someone who was in law enforcement and in media, kind of in both of those worlds, is this seemed like the perfect example where you have both of those entities that are attacking a problem. I'm just curious, your perspective, right? As a journalist, it's you had that intrepid reporter who we saw, them rolling up to the scene. In fact, the woman says, they ask, well, who are you? So who the hell are you, right? We're allowed to be here. By the way, you're on camera. I mean, just talk about that. That it's not just law enforcement, as Kurt said, that solves this problem, but it's the media, it's journalists, it's people doing films like this that are bringing awareness.
Yeah, I mean, I think it takes a village, right? And we all play a part, and so that's the power of storytelling ultimately, right? Is that if you're passionate enough about something and you're willing to tear at the truth and just keep at it, and you collaborate with the kind of people that you need to, you're able to create something powerful and really make a statement. And
Darren, you mentioned this collective of people that were involved in this, the doctors specifically. I mean, the one thing that really struck me is that, of all the people who presumably would know better, right? You got the con men, obviously. You've got people who, are living across the, various parts of the country, impoverished. They're trying to make a buck. But the doctors presumably know what they're doing. Did that surprise you to learn that there are this many shady doctors out there that were willing to raise their hand and be part of something like this?
I mean, at first it did, but now it doesn't. I mean, it's really crazy. And I remember when we were doing all our FOIA requests and getting in all these undercover videos, when I got the video of Dr. Hall at the end who says, whether this is legal or illegal, I have no idea, but I covered my ass. I felt like that was just like the distillation of the film. and how a lot of these doctors sort of operated. They thought that they were going to be protected because, they created a patient file, and the person that came in said they were in pain, and the American Medical Association said it's fine to prescribe these pills. They're not addictive, because Purdue Pharma did a great job of convincing people that was the right thing. So I mean, at the end of the day, it doesn't surprise me, because now we've seen this show many times. So,
and I want to ask you, we were talking, the George brothers saw this film, right?
Oh yeah.
Tell us about that, that experience, and what was their reaction?
Jeff gave it 2 thumbs up. Chris said, I did a decent job.
Decent job. Okay. And I'm just curious, what's the process of someone in prison seeing a film?
Well, it had a premiere on CNN, an edited version of this. So he sat around the common area in the prison with all his friends, and they watched it together. And so.
And how do you, for those who, are in this field, or maybe, aspiring to do something like this, how did you get not 1 but 2 convicted criminals to talk to you on the phone for all of that time to tell the story?
Well, it goes to back to the beginning of the film. They're very competitive still to this day, and so I think when Jeff found out that I was talking to Chris, and Chris knew I was talking to Jeff, they both want to make sure that their side was heard. There's still a dispute about who was more responsible for the idea of the business. Jeff says it was his idea, and Chris says may have been Jeff's idea, but I'm really the one that ran with it and made it what it was, which is probably the truth of the matter. Jeff, there's a sequence in the film of Jeff just being the idea guy, and he just never followed through on anything, but Chris was really the one who would follow through on things. Is that a fair assessment, Kurt, of your?
100%. Jeff was extremely lazy, and Chris, to his credit, actually did work slightly harder and hustled a little bit more and networked a little bit better. So he got the results that he wanted for that.
It's the beauty of narcissists. They like to tell their story.
Yeah, absolutely. Very good. So we're going to take audience questions. Just one question before that. I want to ask Kurt, early in the film, we hear the twins, dad, it's reported he said that cops are stupid because if they weren't, they would be making more money. That didn't work out so well.
Let me be clear again. I'm not a big fan of John George either. Everybody you saw in this film and more, I've met with or interviewed or interacted with in some way, shape, or form, and I am not a fan. So I was more than happy to put his ex-wife, his kids, and his daughter-in-law in prison.
Very good. Let's go to the audience questions. If you have a question, can you please raise your hand? Yes, ma'am, up front.
Okay, this is, I'm having a hard time with this because I could make a lot of comments about what's going on, and then I do have some questions about 50 million. I have a friend who has had 2 stepsons die because of the opioid crisis. And she has one son who is in the cycle of drugs, streets, jail, rehab, drugs, streets, constantly. So, I know some of the stuff that goes on. A comment that the guy who's out on the streets, who's in jail right now, and we're happy because we know he's at least alive and we know where he is. He told me a long time ago that he started on the pills, and then when the pills got to be too expensive, then you turn to heroin because heroin's cheaper. So they talked about the heroin in a different way when the pills weren't available. But part of the opioid crisis and the heroin crisis, they are connected, and I just wanted to put that out.
Mm-hmm.
I know of someone back in the 70s who used to go to doctors. There were clinics even back then where you could go and you could say, oh, I was in a car accident, I was in this, I was in that. And they could get pills, and then, yeah, she sold them. So I'm wondering, between the 70s and now, was it the drug companies giving incentives? I've heard something about that, but, this kind of thing was around.
Yeah.
Sort
So-
of.
That's a good question. Who wants to take
If you don't mind, I'd like to take that one. So just a short history for you. Heroin has been around since the 1800s, opium for millennia, oxycodone since the 1900s. But this problem blew up a few decades ago for a few reasons. Reason number one, the American Medical Association came out with a new directive that basically said pain is now the fifth vital sign and must be treated as such. At the same time, doctors in medical school had little to no education on addiction, little to none. Every one of these 13 doctors we put in prison had no training, except for one actually, had no training in addiction medicine at all. So they didn't understand what they were doing. They were trying to fill this gap. Obviously, this is a criminal organization, but generally speaking, across the board. And last but not least, as Darren mentioned before, Purdue Pharma came out with OxyContin and started a marketing campaign where they lied to everybody about the addictive nature of these drugs. The combination of the three is what led to the massive spread. And to address the law of unintended consequences, once this case and others like it cut off the pill supply, the cartels south of the border started producing heroin more cheaply to fill the gap. And then eventually they realized that fentanyl, which is already an existing drug, could be produced even more cheaply south of the border with supplies from China and other places and distributed the same way. And that's how we got to where we are now. I hope that answers your question.
No, that's very good. Thank you. Thank you so much. Right back here, yes.
Hi there. I was wondering, I know you mentioned narcissism when it comes to the brothers. Can you talk a little bit about the pitching process to the principal interviews? I think they all just came across bizarrely like telling an old funny story of family memories. Like, I think they were all very casual. I wonder, what was the initial conversations like with people you interviewed? Who was the most difficult to book, quote unquote? And then lastly, because you've been so close to the subject matter for many years, what, if anything, surprised you in your research about the topic in the film?
Yeah, thank you. It took some convincing for most of the subjects to participate for obvious reasons. They didn't know how their stories could be handled. They at some point when I first approached them, they were still tied up in the legal system, so they didn't want to jeopardize anything they had going on with their cases. But eventually, when all that was passed, I think it was just like I kind of waited them out. I just had been talking to them for so many years that they finally allowed me to interview them. My interview in process is I don't like to ask too many questions before. I kind of want to come in cold, but and I'm not antagonistic. That's not my approach. I'd like to just sort of let people tell their story and ask questions that are going to let them tell their story. And I always say, tell me a story like you're telling your friend in a bar or something like that. That's how, most of us talk to each other and actually reveal ourselves naturally. And I think if, you go into some interviews require you to be antagonistic, don't get me wrong, but I think I just had the luxury of time with these people. I sat down for some of these interviews for 4 to 8 hours. Kurt was the victim of one of those. And so, I think it's just allowing people to be themselves, and that's ultimately what I want to happen in an interview. Is I want people to reveal themselves as they are and not sort of be some sort of character that they, think I might want them to be.
Excellent question.
You're also a pretty easygoing guy to talk to, so I would imagine, it just kind of flows.
He got me
pretty
to
quickly.
talk.
Yes. Yeah, right there.
So for such a serious film, there's a lot of comedy that comes across. How did you sort of approach comedy when it arrived in the edit?
It's a good question. Thank you, Pete, for that question. From the beginning, we knew this story was absurd, and I really when we were talking about the tone of the film and working with my first editor, Rob Nassau, and also the final editor on this as well. We spoke a lot about the tone and how we strike this, this tone of like capturing the absurdity of the story. I always say, the story. This is the story of the pharmaceutical industry and doctors partnering with a bunch of convicted felons to create the greatest drug racket in the Sunshine State since the cocaine cowboys in the 1980s. And so for me, I always thought it was like crazy that like all these doctors would be like, yeah, sign me up. You were just dealing steroids and now you're running a clinic. So we were trying to like lean into that a little bit. But we realized also that there was going to be a shift in the tone. Like hopefully you're along for the ride, and then halfway through we start addressing the seriousness of this issue, which is also sort of the arc of the story. I think even for the George brothers, when they got into this, they had no idea what the outcome was going to be and how many people were going to show up to the clinic, and how Florida was going to become the epicenter of all this. Almost 90% of the oxycodone in the country being prescribed in one state is insane. And people traveling thousands of miles to these clinics. So I don't think anybody knew the full picture at the beginning. So we sort of thought about like the arc of this being like you start out innocently, it's a little absurd, a little weird, and then, it gradually becomes more and more serious.
Let's just be clear, though. On its face, this thing really was insane and absurd, right? At its core, you're talking about white supremacists, as I said, hiring black doctors and Jewish doctors to sell drugs to poor white people and kill them and not care, and doctors coming along for the ride because they're tripling their salaries, and strippers running clinics. So if you'd have told a normal person that this was going to be the premise of your story and that this is a real thing, they'd laugh at you and tell you that was insane. But that's exactly what happened here. So the absurdity was built in. Darren and and company just managed to shine the light on it and present it for what it was.
Fortunately, we have time for one more. Right up front, please.
Back to the policy thing. How is it possible? I mean, we've known, when I say we, I mean United States citizens, known for decades about an opioid crisis. So how is it possible that 2 weeks ago I hurt my foot going to get x-rays, it's bruised, swollen, but not broken, and I'm given pain medicine, calls it in, doctor calls in, I say, fine, I'll use pain medicine. I go get it from the pharmacy. She hands it to me, fine. I ask the pharmacist, can I drive with this? She goes and gets another pharmacist. Pharmacist then comes and I go, well, try it out first. We'll see how you respond. Try it out first before you see if you can drive with this. I said, okay. Go home. It's now getting late at night, so I take one pill, go to sleep, wake up the next morning, have to teach, have to drive to work. So I'm like, well, I better not take any till I drive. Start teaching at 9:30. Right before I start teaching, I go, I'm going to take a pill because I'm hurting. I'm in pain. My students can see me limp around. I take it. About an hour into teaching, and that's a big long day, I realized, oh my gosh, what's happening to me. I was not able to leave for 10 hours, right? So I sleep in my office. I finally leave, go home, call my son, going, wow, this pain medicine really got me. He looks it up. It's an opioid. How is it that the doctor prescribed it didn't tell me he's giving an opioid? It's not on the bottle. 2 pharmacists talked to me. No one told me it's an opioid that they gave me. How is that not policy that it's on the bottle? They have to tell you.
Anything legal there, you think?
I don't know, to be honest with you. That's a matter of not only state law, but American Medical Association training and teaching of all the doctors across the country, the state medical boards. There are multiple entities involved in your doctor's conduct and behavior, and I really can't speak to what spurred that. I'm disappointed to hear that, obviously, after what I spent 5 years doing. We did make some changes across the country, but there's still pockets where this behavior continues. So,
yeah, and on that note, it's interesting. I know a lot of doctors who say that it's almost like the fear factor now. When they see their colleagues prosecuted for malfeasance, even that is a deterrent in a lot of cases. Maybe not your case, unfortunately, sir, but we see that, we hear about those deterrents. I want to thank you all very, very much. Thank you all for coming out to watch this incredible film. Just one programming note, this film, American Pain, premieres this Thursday on the HBO streaming platform Max, so spread the word again on Thursday. And let's give it up one more time, a round of applause for our team here.